Okay, everybody, we're back. I've had a chance to look through some of the other videos that we've made today here, and it looks like things are going pretty good in terms of quality and everything. So let's just go ahead and kind of keep moving on here, and we're getting into chapter 3 of Popper's epic text, The Open Society and Its Enemies. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 of this series and all the videos that I made to introduce it, just have a look at the playlist. It should be The Open Society and Its Enemies should be the title of that. But okay, let's go ahead and just dive right back in here. Here's chapter 3. This is one that's going to take a little bit longer than the last two. And part of the reason why is because what Popper's doing in this chapter is going through Plato's theory of forms or ideas, which is kind of a difficult proposition. And Popper is going to make a couple of fairly large leaps of inference here. So let's be faithful to his reading, but we won't hold back criticism, and we won't, obviously be overly charitable in our critical reading of Popper. So he starts off by basically comparing Plato to Heraclitus. They're both aristocrats. They're both part of troubled times politically. Things were better for both of them when they were younger, and seemed to kind of get worse as they got older. They lost status and so on and so forth. So just diving right in here, Plato was born during the war. He was about 24 when it ended. It brought terrible epidemics, and in its last year, famine, the fall of the city of Athens, civil war, and a rule of terror, usually called the rule of the 30 Tyrants. These were led by two of Plato's uncles, who both lost their lives in the unsuccessful attempt to uphold their regime against the Democrats. The reestablishment of the democracy and of peace meant no respite for Plato. His beloved teacher Socrates, whom he later made the main speaker of most of his dialogues, was tried and executed. Plato himself seems to have been in danger. Together with other companions of Socrates, he left Athens. So things were tough. And I think even being critical here, we must acknowledge the fact that Plato did not necessarily do the best in the Athenian democracy. There's kind of some controversy around the seventh letter which Plato wrote as well, which contains sort of some recommendations for running a state that don't seem to be maybe the best. So in terms of governance, we can probably be fairly sure that Popper's right, that Plato was at least somewhat on the conservative end of things. However, the difficulty comes in when we read Plato as speaking his mind through Socrates, because I think there's at least a possibility that some of what Socrates is saying is designed to look suspect to the reader to some extent. And I think, if Plato was sort of the one-dimensional character that Popper wants to make him out to be in this text, the tough part about that, in my mind at least, is just simply that, few things are ever really that simple, right? So my spider sense is always kind of turned on just a little bit here. But okay, this brief outline of political events may help to explain why we find in the work of Plato, as in that of Heraclitus, indications that he suffered desperately under the political instability and insecurity of his time. Like Heraclitus, Plato was of royal blood. At least the tradition claims that his father's family traced his descent from Codrus, the last of the tribal kings of Attica. Plato was very proud of his mother's family, which, as he explains in his dialogues in the Charmides and the Timaeus, was related to that of Solon, the lawgiver of Athens. And then his uncles Critias and Charmides were the leading men of the 30 Tyrants. And so basically Plato is born into a political family, and the reason for that is, the reason that is important is that there is a certain level of privilege that's conveyed to him by birth. And then so basically Popper's argument is that for Plato and for Heraclitus, things start off really good for them and then they get worse. And so both of them sort of make the leap from the particular to the general and say that there's a natural law of historical development, and what Popper says here is, according to this law, which will be more fully discussed in the next chapter, all social change is corruption or decay or degeneration. And in the story of the statesman, there is also the suggestion that after the lowest point of complete corruption has been reached, the god will again retake the helm of the cosmic ship and things will start to improve. Really, it's all just kind of gobbledygook. Popper here says it is not certain how far Plato believed in the story of the statesman. He made it quite clear that he did not believe that all of it was literally true. And so where do you draw the line in that sense? Well, Popper has a reason to draw it where he draws it, and we shouldn't necessarily write that off because that is one possible read. But on the other hand, that's only one of the possible reads. And so when we're looking at this, we're not sure how much salt to take Plato's Socrates with, so to speak. Okay, moving right along, he says, it seems likely that the prophecy in the statesman of the return of the golden age of a new millennium is the expression of such a belief in the form of a myth. However this may be, he certainly believed in both, in a general historical tendency towards corruption and in the possibility that we may stop further corruption in the political field by arresting all political change. This, accordingly, is the aim he strives for. He tries to realize it by the establishment of a state which is free from the evils of all other states because it does not degenerate, because it does not change. The state which is free from the evil of change and corruption is the best, the perfect state. It is the state of the golden age which knew no change. It is the arrested state. You could probably also call it the ideal state. And the move that Popper is highlighting here is this move from which Plato basically makes from sort of philosophy of language, where you're looking at the world and you're saying, okay, all these things are recognizable because they share a form in common, and that form is the ideal version, and the things you actually find won't be the form itself. They'll just be sort of these cheap replicas that exist in the physical world and are therefore inferior to the ultimate form. He says, but Plato also extended his belief in a perfect state that does not change to the realm of all things. He believed that to every kind of ordinary or decaying thing there corresponds also a perfect thing that does not decay. This belief in perfect and unchanging things, usually called the theory of forms or ideas, became the central doctrine of his philosophy. In order to gain a better understanding of this out-and-out historicist attitude and to analyze the opposite tendency inherent in Plato's belief that he could influence fate, I shall contrast historicism as we find it in Plato with a diametrically opposite approach also to be found in Plato, which may be called the attitude of social engineering. And so what Popper's sort of doing here is he's setting up this dichotomous read of Plato. And on the one hand, we've got sort of the offensive read, which is the most political part of this work of political philosophy, which actually got this book rejected from a number of publishers back in the 40s when Popper was shopping it around. And essentially what was going on was that people were reading it and they're seeing this just out-and-out critique of Plato, one of the fathers of modern philosophy, as an authoritarian. And they weren't looking quite so much at the other thread, the attitude of social engineering here for Popper, which is sort of a bit more charitable. And so I think at the end of the day, what Popper's doing is something that's warranted, and I think there's a decent chance that Plato is somebody who, even for Popper, is an important read. So he says, as opposed to the historicist who believes that intelligent political action is possible only if the future course of history is first determined, the social engineer believes that a scientific basis of politics would be a very different thing. It would consist of the factual information necessary for the construction or alteration of social institutions in accordance with our wishes and aims. Such a science would have to tell us what steps we must take if we wish, for instance, to avoid depressions, or else to produce depressions, or if we wish to make the distribution of wealth more even or less even. In other words, the social engineer conceives as the scientific basis of politics something like a social technology. Plato, as we shall see, compares it with the scientific background of medicine, as opposed to the historicist, who understands it as a science of immutable historical tendencies. So the idea is that the technological view, even for Popper, even in the 1940s, is the view that things are still developing, that things are still sort of getting better, and that as the technology itself improves, the methods of governance that the technology yields will also tend to improve. And so this is really the basis for the open society. We're not seeing in Popper sort of this neglect of the Platonic origin, or of the ancient Greek origin at the very least, of the concept of a social technology, i.e. government, and this social engineering viewpoint, right? So we can't just take Popper's criticism of Plato and leave it at that. We have to take his praise of Plato as well, even though it's a little bit more veiled than it might be here in the actual text, right? And part of the reason that we want to actually read these books is to see these sort of dynamics at play in them. If you just watched somebody's criticism, or if you just read an essay about this, it might be very easy to miss some of these threads. So it is important to go ahead and get the actual book out at some point and see what it actually says there. And then, so the historicist is inclined to look upon social institutions mainly from the point of view of their history, i.e. their origin, their development, and their present and future significance. He may perhaps insist that their origin is due to a definite plan or design, and to the pursuit of definite ends, either human or divine. Or he may assert that they are not designed to serve any clearly conceived ends, but are rather the immediate expression of certain instincts and passions. Or he may assert that they have once served as a means to definite ends, but they have lost this character. The social engineer and technologist, on the other hand, will hardly take much interest in the origin of institutions or in the original intentions of their founders, although there is no reason why he should not recognize the fact that only a minority of social institutions are consciously designed, while the vast majority have just grown as the undesigned results of human actions. Rather, he will put his problem like this: if such and such are our aims, is this institution well designed and organized to serve them? As an example, we may consider the institution of insurance. And so basically what Popper wants to do here is just look at sort of these big time institutions that are all a major part of our lives. So today we might look at something like health insurance and say, okay, so this is the system that's kind of grown up ever since it was declared legal to do healthcare for a profit. And so there are these problems that have kind of come with that, but there are also some good things that have come with that. And so as we look at reforming our healthcare system, as we continuously do these days in politics, one of the important things to sort of get a sense of is, whether it was consciously designed or whether it has just kind of developed to be the way that it is. And so Popper says down here, in his function as a citizen who pursues certain ends in which he believes, he may demand that these ends and the appropriate measures should be adopted, but as a technologist, he would carefully distinguish between the question of the ends and their choice and questions concerning the facts, i.e. the social effects of any measure which might be taken. And so these would be endpoints like the number of people that have care, the number of people without care, the quality of care, the amount of time that people have to wait to receive care, and so on and so forth for our healthcare example here. And so basically the idea is that what we want to do if we're going to be social engineers creating social technology is we want to be objective about the way that we approach the issue. We need to be careful and painstaking to pick up facts to use in our investigation. And as we draft our theories, we need to subject those to the criticism that comes from the data that we collect in this effort, right? So we're not just out there making things up. What we want to do is we want to have the best, most empirical model that we can, and then go from there to trying to deduce what the facts are. So it's fairly standard. It's about what you would expect from Karl Popper. He is a renowned philosopher of science. He believes primarily in the scientific method. His main purpose in writing this book is neither economic nor really what you might think of as like social justice. It's mainly just making sure that people have the freedom to be scientific about the things that they do. And the main thing he wants us to be scientific about is the way that our government is created and set up and run. So he says the perfect state, and we're back to Plato here, the perfect state is something like the first ancestor, the primogenitor of the later states, which are, as it were, the degenerate offspring of this perfect or best or ideal state. An ideal state which is not a mere phantasm nor a dream, nor an idea in our mind, but which is, in view of its stability, more real than all those decaying societies which are in flux and liable to pass away at any moment. And so you might think of, say the American democracy or the French democracy or the Roman democracy, and sort of when they were created and they were popularly supported, these are all things that were very widely held to be just the best in terms of social technology. And as they have kind of continued to be employed, a lot of democratic societies around the world have crumbled. And so the United States democracy is in this unique point in its history where what we've done is we've actually tested sort of our democratic institutions, and we've seen the strength of them under the presidency of Donald Trump, and sort of all the authoritarian things that Trump wanted to do, which haven't worked. Biden has won the election, Trump has been thrown out of office, and it's extremely likely that we'll just watch the decline, so to speak, of the naked emperor of 2016 over the next few years, and we won't see a serious political challenge in 2024 from him, although it's certainly possible that I'm wrong about that. There is this sense, I believe, in Plato in which democracy is something that you have to constantly fight for, and I think what Popper's doing here is really bringing that out and calling that to our attention. And in Plato, I want to say that I do believe that it's incredibly reasonable that we see this theory of forms, because I believe that this does tie directly into a major philosophy of language question. And I think that Plato studied the way that we use words and drew certain conclusions about it. Now, is the purpose of the theory of forms to be pedagogical and to sort of educate people about what it isn't, so to speak, which, if we're reading Plato and we're thinking, okay, there's some communication between ancient Greece and ancient India, and maybe a little Buddhism is kind of leaking in, and these people are responding to it in these writings. Because if that's the case, then, Popper is not being nearly charitable enough with regard to the theory of forms or the theory of ideas, which isn't really elaborated anywhere all that convincingly. You can read about it in the Timaeus, and I believe the Meno touches on it a little bit, but there's never a place where Plato just sits down and elaborates the entire theory of forms in a way that could be taken as something like a logical proof. There's always the possibility that Socrates in the dialogue is using the theory of forms to make some sort of larger overarching point that's not what Popper is reading here. So just a grain of salt there for you as we continue on with this. As before, we must insist that the form or idea, in spite of its name, is no idea in our mind. It is not a phantasm nor a dream, but a real thing. It is instead more real than all the ordinary things which are in flux, and which, in spite of their apparent solidity, are doomed to decay. For the form or the idea is a thing that is perfect and does not perish. If you're looking at the real world versus, say, your memory of something, you will find that the things do decay, and there's no real way around it. And our memories, our memories of things, if you look to neuroscience, actually do decay as well. So there are issues sort of for this, if we want to be ontological about it and look at the way things really are. But if the purpose of the theory of forms is more pedagogical and more oriented, as I suspect it might be, towards theories of language, then maybe this is just a little bit harsh in terms of the read, and maybe slightly misguided. So, as a child may look upon his father, seeing in him an ideal, a unique model, a godlike personification of his own aspiration, the embodiment of perfection, of wisdom, of stability, glory, and virtue, the power which created him before his world began, which now preserves and sustains him, and in virtue of which he exists, so Plato looks upon the forms or ideas. But in the Timaeus, Plato goes one step beyond his earlier teaching when he represents the contact of the form or idea with the world of space and time by an extension of his simile. He describes abstract space in which the sensible things move, originally the space or gap between heaven and earth, as a receptacle, and compares it with the mother of things, in which at the beginning of time the sensible things are created by the forms, which stamp or impress themselves upon pure space and thereby give their offspring shape. We must conceive, writes Plato, three kinds of things. First, those which undergo generation. Secondly, that in which the generation takes place. And thirdly, the model in whose likeness the generated things are born. And we may compare the receiving principle to a mother, and the model to a father, and their product to a child. And it's fascinating to me to look at this and to see just how far Popper is able to kind of push this thing. But because to me, what's taking place here, especially in this quote, there's a read in which the model exists in people's heads and not necessarily like divorced or removed from them somehow. Or perhaps the model exists in language. And that's one way that we can read this as well. If you want the theory of forms of a chair, for example, then there obviously are things that we consider to be chairs, and we can just go get a look at a number of them. But yeah, a little bit more about that from Popper. He says, to any single one of these forms or ideas belongs its offspring or race of sensible things, another kind of things, bearing the name of their form and resembling it, but perceptible to sense, created, always in flux, generated in space, which is likened to the mother, and is described thus. There is a third kind, which is space, and is eternal, and cannot be destroyed, and which provides a home for all generated things. And so that's kind of the physical plane on which we exist. He says, there is, however, an important difference between Greek mythology and Plato's theory of forms or ideas. While the Greeks venerated many gods as the ancestors of various tribes or families, the theory of ideas demands that there should be only one form or idea of man, for it is one of the central doctrines of the theory of forms that there is only one form of every race or kind of things. And that seems maybe just a little bit, I don't know. He's being really analytical here. He says, in the Republic, which is earlier than the Timaeus, Plato had explained his point even more clearly, using as his example the essential bed, i.e. the form or idea of a bed. God has made one essential bed, and only one. Two or more he did not produce and never will. For even if God were to make two, and no more, then another would be brought to light, namely the form exhibited by those two. This, and not those two, would then be the essential bed. And so, when we make abstractions about things that we find in the world, and there's this whole process we go through. I enumerate that in my book, Formal Dialectics. And essentially, I believe that what happens is we develop a symbol, which is non-specific for a given thing: chair, lamp, computer. And so the idea that we've got here is that computer and Apple Mac or Windows PC those aren't the same forms, right? The essential form is computer. Mac and PC are two different types of computer, and they're not identical, but all computers, I guess, more or less get their character from the computer, which is sort of the particular version of the general instance, or of the general concept which we're looking at in any particular instance. And so there are some issues here. This is fairly heady stuff, I guess, in the sense that it's kind of difficult to wrap your mind around. But on the other hand, I think it is fairly simple to do once you actually put the effort in. So yeah, he says down here, the fact that this theory is designed to explain the sensible things does not seem at first sight to be in any way connected with historicism, but it is, and as Aristotle tells us, it was just this connection which induced Plato to develop the theory of ideas. I shall attempt to give an outline of this development using Aristotle's account together with some indications in Plato's own writing. And so here Popper is actually sort of admitting that he's trying to make his case based upon the insufficient evidence that exists, and I think that's an important thing to kind of take note of here. So moving right along, what he was looking for was knowledge, not opinion, the pure rational knowledge of a world that does not change, but at the same time knowledge that could be used to investigate this changing world, and especially this changing society, political change, with its strange historical laws. Plato aimed at discovering the secret of the royal knowledge of politics, of the art of ruling men. But an exact science of politics seems as impossible as any exact knowledge of a world in flux. There were no fixed objects in the political field. How could one discuss any political questions when the meaning of words like government or state or city changed with every new phrase in the historical development? That's actually a pretty important point. Socrates, in the dialogues, develops what we call stipulative definitions. So he asks people to agree to the meanings of terms and not fluctuate between various different senses in which they can be used during the discussion. And that's sort of where the dialectic starts, because in a dialectic, you're allowed to sort of explore the different senses in which terms can mean various different things. But it's hard to do that unless you start with the stipulative definition at first, because people will tend to just use a term in whatever sense is most advantageous at the moment. So you end up kind of chasing your tail and going in circles if you try to pick up a dialectic without doing the stipulative definition, selection process first. So he says political theory must have seemed to Plato in his Heraclitean period to be just as elusive, fluctuating, and unfathomable as political practice. Socrates was interested in ethical matters. He was an ethical reformer, a moralist who pestered all kinds of people, forcing them to think, to explain, and to account for the principles of their actions. He used to question them and was not easily satisfied by their answers. The typical reply which he received, that we act in a certain way because it is wise to act in this way, or perhaps efficient or just or pious, etc., only incited him to continue his questions by asking what is wisdom or efficiency or justice or piety. So Socrates was in a way. It was natural, says Aristotle, that Socrates should search for the essence, i.e. for the virtue or rationale of a thing, and for the real, unchanging, or essential meanings of the terms. In this connection, he became the first to raise the problem of universal definitions. And yeah, like we just said, stipulative definitions are kind of what he innovated there to do that. But I think that the uncharitableness of the Popper reading here that we're kind of going through is sort of predicated in the difficulty of talking about what Plato and Socrates were actually really up to, which is sort of exploring the limits of language and coming up with like sort of an ideal way to use language to get kind of at the heart of things. So though there could be no definition of any sensible thing, they were always changing. There could be definitions and true knowledge of things of a different kind, of the virtues of the sensible things. If knowledge or thought were to have an object, there would have to be some different, some unchanging entities, apart from those which are sensible, says Aristotle. And he reports of Plato that things of this other sort, then, he called forms or ideas. And the sensible things, he said, were distinct from them, and all called after them. And the many things which have the same name as a certain form or idea exist by participating in it. So by being called that name, right? Which is fascinating, because, I don't know. I mean, to me it seems very difficult to imagine that Plato and Socrates, these brilliant minds, would make such juvenile errors here. You know, I tend to want to read them very charitably because I think they were remarkable philosophers. But, you know, there are things that we can learn by being less charitable. And so let's just kind of keep going with the Popper reading here. He says, he wanted to obtain purely rational knowledge and not merely opinion. And since pure knowledge of sensible things could not be obtained, he insisted, as mentioned before, on obtaining at least such pure knowledge as was in some way related and applicable to sensible things. The form was the accountable representative of the sensible things and could therefore be consulted in important questions concerning the world of flux. And so when we look at this and we think about, you know, what the world of flux is, i.e. the sensible world that's around us, and we think about the forms or the words, maybe, or the concepts referred to by the words, to be a little bit more specific, what we think of is sort of the abstracted qualities of a chair, which allow you to then define what a chair is by pointing and saying that's a chair, but that's a table, so that's not a chair. Then what you look at is basically the way in which human beings develop symbols to refer to objects in the world. And so the big sort of mystery for Plato and for Socrates here, according to Popper, was basically how are these things related to these verbal symbols that we then use to refer to them, and how, in some sense, are we going to be able to ascertain the relationship between what the verbal symbol or the written symbol is and the object that it refers to. And I think we have better efforts to sort of get all the way there now. But would we, if not for Plato? I think maybe we wouldn't, because, I mean, it's just really important to start somewhere. And then, you know, obviously people come along and improve on the systems that we make, and things get better and technology improves. This part's great. He says, I use the name Methodological Essentialism to characterize the view held by Plato and many of his followers that it is the task of pure knowledge or science to discover and describe the true nature of things, i.e. their hidden reality or essence. And there was an essay that Pierre Hadot did that was called Beyond the Veil of Isis. And then so I've got that little note there that says what we don't already know. And so sort of this openness that permeates this book, I believe, is actually something that could on some level be ascribed to Plato, because at the end of the day, the hidden reality or essence of a thing is something that's not generally included in the definition of that thing. And it's more particular to those things. So according to methodological essentialism, there can be three ways of knowing a thing. I mean that we can know its unchanging reality or essence, and that we can know the definition of the essence, and that we can know its name. So the name is the symbol, the unchanging reality or essence is going to be the concept, and then the definition of the essence is going to be sort of the set of properties that we ascribe to such things, right? So he says, methodological essentialism, i.e. the theory that it is the aim of science to reveal essences and describe them by means of definition, can be better understood when contrasted with its opposite, methodological nominalism. Instead of aiming at finding out what a thing really is and at defining its true nature, methodological nominalism aims at describing how a thing behaves in various circumstances, and especially whether there are any regularities in its behavior. So the relevance of this to science is incredible. I mean, Richard Feynman said famously that the electron does not exist in nature. The electron is a theory that helps us to describe what happens in nature. So the distinction, obviously, is that nobody has ever seen an electron. Nobody needs to see an electron to continue using the theory of the electron to accurately describe nature and make things like the wonderful gadgets that I'm broadcasting for you on right now. Okay, and moving right along, he says, and to those philosophers who tell them before having answered the what is question, he cannot hope to give exact answers to any of the how questions. He will reply, if at all, by pointing out that he much prefers that modest degree of exactness which he can achieve by his methods to the pretentious muddle which they have achieved by theirs. All right, so yeah, yeah. Okay, so as indicated by our example, methodological nominalism is nowadays fairly generally accepted in the natural sciences. The problems of the social sciences, on the other hand, are still, for the most part, treated by essentialist methods. This is, in my opinion, one of the main reasons for their backwardness. But many who have noticed this situation judge it differently. They believe that the difference in method is necessary and that it reflects an essential difference between the natures of these two fields of research. And so when we talk about methodological essentialism, the idea is that what we want to get at is the sort of objective reality or the absolute truth. And even science doesn't do that anymore, right? Like there is an actual meter somewhere. Like they just chopped a thing and said, okay, that's 1 meter long. And then they divided that into centimeters and millimeters and made kilometers out of it. And really what it is just a completely arbitrary abstraction. A meter could be a third of the length of a meter currently, and it wouldn't change anything. The math would just have more threes in it if that was to be the case. And so it doesn't matter. And when we recognize the arbitrariness of the symbol, Popper wants to say that what we're participating in is the philosophical school of thought known as nominalism. Things are what we call them. Or the name is sort of this handle that we create by which to sort of elaborate about what something is. So down here he says we must grasp their essence. So the historicist argument concludes and lay it down in the form of a definition. These modern arguments are, I think, very similar to those reported above, which, according to Aristotle, led Plato to his doctrine of forms or ideas. The only difference is that Plato, who did not accept the atomic theory and knew nothing about energy, applied his doctrine to the realm of physics also, and thus to the world as a whole. We have here an indication of the fact that in the social sciences, a discussion of Plato's methods may be topical even today. So there's this issue with the social sciences that's coming up a lot here, which is that, according to Popper, they're not really scientific at all. They do a bad job of sort of getting into measurable hypotheses and empirical means, and so they just kind of chase their tails quite a bit. And I think that was probably a pretty accurate critique back then. I think it's still somewhat accurate. Like if you want to see an example of this, just look at all the different dialogue about people who voted for Donald Trump in the 2020 and the 2016 election. You get all kinds of different hypotheses. There's not really just a ton of data to back them up. And obviously there are some problems with polling. So the information that we already have is just not quite as good as it hopefully would be. So he says, my survey of the historicist features of Platonism is therefore strongly critical. Although I admire much in Plato's philosophy, far beyond those parts which I believe to be Socratic, I do not take it as my task to add to the countless tributes to his genius I'm rather bent on destroying what is, in my opinion, mischievous in this philosophy. It is the totalitarian tendency of Plato's political philosophy, which I shall try to analyze and to criticize. And so that's what he's doing, and he's completely honest about it here. So there are sort of threads to the Platonic philosophical smorgasbord, right? To the Platonic charcuterie board, right? So maybe these things are essential, maybe they're not. But what Popper wants to do is just really kind of shed some light on some of the darker places in the political philosophy of Plato. And so that was a thing that was extremely controversial about this book when it first came out. And indeed, to my wit, it still is quite controversial. So as far as I'm concerned, there's a great that maybe Popper is not being entirely charitable here. I think Popper is quite willing to give us that. So anyway, that is the end of chapter 3. Don't forget to comment, subscribe, and follow the channel, and look at the playlist to make sure you've got access to all our wonderful videos here. And yeah, that's the end of chapter 3. I'll be seeing you soon with chapter 4. Thanks. Bye.